Today, we're going to quickly run over the highest damage builds and build paths for OB7. With almost all damage items being nerfed, some things have shuffled around since last time, so let's get into it. If you haven't seen my last video, I'd recommend watching that as I go more in depth over build order in that video. This graph shows the top DPS first items for ADCs. Not much has changed from last patch, except now Braggy's Harp has a higher DPS than Kin's. An Avenging Blade is appearing in the top 10 highest DPS first items an ADC can build. Of course, it's not all about damage. If we run a cost analysis on these items, Sunbeam Bow still comes out on top, and is a solid first item even after being nerfed. The next best power curve item is Braggy's Harp, and then Kin's, which has fallen to the third best. So now Braggy's Harp is a better first item than Kin's, but not by too much. I think it's worth mentioning that the passives and actives of items weren't nerfed, just the base stats. So an item like Brace of the Abyss did lose 15 intelligence, but it has kept the full extra basic attack damage on its passive, meaning it has effectively been nerfed slightly less relative to some other items. But it still has the issue of being very poor for farming. The same is true for Dagger of Frenzy, whose active component hasn't been nerfed, making it much more desirable as an aggressive first item in this patch. I'd recommend Sunbeam Bow, Braggy's Harp and Dagger of Frenzy as the best aggressive first items on ADCs. Lifesteal items were also nerfed, but with time to kill in the early game being slightly higher now after the item nerfs, lifesteal is probably slightly more valuable, and pro players like Zapman were already buying Devour's Gauntlet first. So I'd recommend at least trying out lifesteal items and seeing how they feel. They might do less damage, but the sustain is very valuable. Now let's look at the best 2 item combinations. Deathbringer and Demon Blade are now first on the list. This is because I have now allowed Demon Blade to be fully stacked if another crit item is in the build. So crit builds have been buffed in my simulation. Things are very similar to last time. For the power curve analysis, combinations of Kin's, Sunbeam and Braggy's Harp are appearing at the top. So these are the kind of 2 item combinations I would go for. If you've gone Lifesteal as your first item, you still want to be pairing lifesteal items with Sunbeam Bow, Braggy's and Kin's as your second item. For 3 item power spikes, having Deathbringer and Demon Blade in your build will be the highest possible damage combination you can have, pairing them with Sunbeam Bow, Braggy's Harp and Kin's. But they are of course expensive options. Once we run the power curve analysis, crit becomes a lot weaker, with pure yellow damage items being shown to be the most cost efficient and giving you the best power curve. For the best 3 item combinations with lifesteal, Devour's Gauntlet is the highest damage lifesteal item you can have, with Devour's Gauntlet, Demon Blade and Deathbringer being in the highest damage combination, but it's followed not too far behind by Devour's Gauntlet, Braggy's and Kin's. When we consider power curve, the yellow damage items of course come out on top, with Sunbeam Bow and Kin's proving to still be great power curve items in this patch. Once we move on to 4 items, where we no longer consider DPS against just the enemy ADC, but DPS against the whole enemy team, the highest damage combination is Braggy's, Kin's, Demon Blade and Deathbringer. More interestingly is the now lack of Executioner in the top 3 builds, after it received an attack speed nerf this patch, with Braggy's, Dominance and Sunbeam Bow all providing more damage than Executioner when paired with Kin's, Demon Blade and Deathbringer. But this is because I have allowed Executioner to only have 3 stacks. If it had the full 4 stacks, this combination would likely appear as the top build. Once we run the power curve analysis, the pure yellow damage build does come out on top. So if you're behind in farm and your team is losing, this is probably the build you should be aiming for to give you the best chance of winning the game. Now let's move on to top builds. Let's start with Sharpshooter's arrow builds. Here are the top DPS builds when the enemy solo laner and support both have Spectral. We can see the yellow build is the best in the early game, but begins to get outpaced by the other builds once the crit items come online. The blue build is the best late game, but has a poor early game and suffers greatly because its build path calls for Deathbringer second. Every item in the blue build is a late game item, meaning its build path feels dreadful no matter what order you build the items in, but it does make up for this in late game damage. The purple build also has a solid build path, with Braggy's in this build, meaning you can comfortably build Braggy's first and Kin's second. I want to note here that the way I've now modelled Demon Blade means it is fully stacked when appearing in a build with another crit item. This is why my algorithm almost always picks Deathbringer and then Demon Blade in that order. But the maths for this is a little bit iffy behind the scenes. So yes, you do want to build Demon Blade and Deathbringer side by side in builds, but which one you choose first is completely up to you. When we look at the top DPS Sharpshooter arrow builds with lifesteal, and when both enemy tanks have Spectral, crit falls out of favour slightly, with the top build containing no crit at all, and also having the best build path of any of the builds shown here. The red build is also a solid crit build, but but be aware your power curve is really weak when compared to the other builds. For the top Sharpshooter arrow builds when enemies don't have Spectral, here are the top DPS builds and correct build paths. Of course, crit is shown to be great in this situation, with Deathbringer and Demon Blade appearing in every top 5 combination. The red build has the best build path purely because it can integrate Sunbeam Bow as a first item, making it a much stronger build throughout the early and mid game. The yellow build also has a solid power curve, but pure crit and pen builds like the green and purple builds are much weaker earlier on in the game. For Sharpshooter's arrow when the enemy doesn't have Spectral, and lifesteal has been forced into the builds, we can see Devar's Gauntlet does provide the most late game damage, and you should still be building Deathbringer and Demon Blade in every build. Again, Bloodforge has the best early game damage, but Devar's Gauntlet outpaces it after they are fully stacked. Now let's look at Hunter's Cowl builds. When the enemy has Spectral, unsurprisingly, yellow damage takes the top spot in the blue build, and also has the best build path, showing it is the least risky build an ADC can build, coming in cheap and extremely hard to counter. The red build shows that crit is still viable, even when enemies have Spectral and the starter item is Hunter's Cowl, but we can see just how weak the early game of the red build is. When the enemies do have Spectral and we force lifesteal into the builds, again, Devar's Gauntlet is favoured, but more interestingly is the complete lack of crit now. If you want to build lifesteal and Hunter's Cowl, building crit can be very risky, as if the enemy buys Spectral, it greatly diminishes your overall damage. Ignore the yellow build. The build path is incorrect because I haven't told my algorithm to force Nimble Ring into the first item slot, which means the build path is incorrect and is showing as much better than it really is. Now let's consider the build paths for Hunter's Cowl when the enemies don't have Spectral. Again, we can see Deathbringer and Demon Blade in every build, with the red build showing as having the best power curve. The blue and purple builds are severely lacking in the early game due to the builds apprising mostly of late game items. And for lifesteal builds with Hunter's Cowl and when the enemies don't have Spectral, crit is shown to be strong, but not essential at all, as even when enemies don't have Spectral armor, the third highest damage build possible contains no crit. There is a great argument for not building crit if you're building Hunter's Cowl and Lifesteal, as the green build has the best build path of all the builds displayed here, and is the third highest damage build possible under these conditions, and it has the benefit of not being countered at all by Spectral armor. And that's all of the build paths and top builds for OB7. I hope you enjoyed, and remember, don't guess, do the math.